But it was through this time, and I didn't limit myself. Once I found out that there were objections to Josh's book, for example, and others, I didn't immediately jump over and start reading everything that I could against Christianity and religion. I kept it as balanced as I could. I went, okay, well, what about this issue? Let me see what I can find both ways on this. And while I can quote you the names of some of the people who were most influential, like Farrell Till and Colonel Ingersoll, Bertrand Russell, Voltaire, Dan Barker, all these guys, I didn't just read atheist propaganda. I was starting with a bias that not only was Christianity real, but I was going to have to find enough evidence to convince me that it wasn't before I'd ever change my mind. And while there's sites out there with good information like BibleTrash.com, I also spent a lot of time at carm.org, which is the Christian Apologetics and Resource Ministry, and a few other apologist sites where they responded. And there's an ongoing debate. It's not settled as to the issue, but when you start looking at the evidence and the arguments, the apologist replies aren't very convincing. It's, okay, you found the fatal flaw in our writing, but it could be this too. And then, I had a guy that I was speaking with.
Incidentally, I think it's good that you went to apologist sites too, because that is actually, we've talked about evidence that demands a verdict,
right.
McDowell's book, before on the show, and one of the big criticisms that we have of it is that it was completely one-sided. I mean, he looked for Christians to convince him that Christianity was true, and when they said what they said, he replied, "Oh, okay, that makes sense to me," and he just went on about his business and eventually became a Christian. And that's really shallow.
Well, Lee Strobel was actually worse about it, because Lee tried to make it look like in the Case for Christ, the Case for Creator, etc., he tried to make it look like he was
I'm thinking of Lee Strobel.
Yeah, he might have been.
My mistake.
He would try and make it look like he was getting the skeptic side, but he would pick extremely weak arguments and nothing really substantial. Josh's books did have commentary, which was all one-sided.
Yeah, and that's kind of one thing I was thinking about while you were talking is if you want to convince people that you're right, it's a really bad idea to suppress the other side because it's easily detectable by somebody who thinks about it.
Sure.
And they might not know what's wrong with your arguments because you don't present the other side, but they start to think more and more, this is really not giving me information. It's, and if somebody detects that you're hiding some arguments, some counter arguments, most reasonable people will go look for them.
Yeah, that's in a real way. That's kind of what was happening to me. Was I read Josh's book, and while I could have accepted it all on face value and said, "Hey, here's a guy who's much smarter than me, who's done all the research, who's presenting all these arguments, and he's got historical proof and things which look real and are probably likely. There's no reason for me to look any further. This book has settled it for me." For whatever reason, and I don't know that I was practiced enough to be able to spot the particular flaws in his arguments or in the evidence that he presented, but there were bits of it that just weren't hitting home. And it was in looking for other answers or better explanations. I wasn't necessarily looking for somebody to say, here's what's wrong with that and why. It was, explain this in another way because Josh didn't do it well enough. And after going through all that, I didn't immediately just, after, and this is a several years long process that I did lots of reading on lots of subjects, and there was a period of 2 years that I took off work or was between jobs, but I stayed at home quite a bit during that time and read. And my entire purpose for doing this was to reinforce my faith because I had considered, okay, now I've got my GI Bill, it's time for me to go back to school. I can also go to seminary, which is something I'd considered doing, in my late teens as well. But I couldn't justify going to seminary if I still had doubts. I needed to reaffirm things, so I started studying. At some point, after a year, 2 years, my position was, I no longer necessarily identified myself as a Christian, but I certainly didn't consider myself an atheist. It was, okay, this could or couldn't be true. I'm still leaning towards, there is a God, but I need to keep reading and doing more research. I need to keep thinking about this and considering arguments. And the other thing that hit me was, well, you can't just discuss about Christianity. Because what if I were to absolutely prove, which isn't possible, that everything about Christianity is completely false, and it's not a religion worth being a member of. The beliefs are unfounded, and it's bad juju. That doesn't mean that there's no God. That doesn't mean that some other religion didn't get it right. It didn't really mean much at all, except for this one thing is wrong. And that forced me to kind of broaden the research I was doing into things. Okay, let's say for a second that I did find out that Christianity isn't the right thing. Are there other religions that might be? So you need to take a look into various sects of Christianity, various doctrines, Protestant, Catholic, and then all the different varieties of Protestants that come along. Because one thing you notice is that while we do often on the show get calls from fundamentalists, we also get calls from some liberal Christians who agree with us on a number of issues, for church-state separation. They've adopted an idea that is often more of, we're taking the good stuff and building a religion on it and ignoring the bad stuff. Somebody got something wrong there because that is just inconsistent with our concept of a benevolent God. So, they're not professing any direct, literal truth to the Bible. But it was in the process of reviewing other religions and studying philosophical arguments for the existence of God and everything else that the balance of this began to tip. And it seemed far more reasonable to me that if we're going to establish a belief on anything, if we're going to try and determine reality from fantasy and build beliefs and understandings, the best way to do that is to look for real evidence. And that's not saying I have to see it to believe it. I mean, I haven't seen an atom, or at least not an individual one, blah, blah, blah. I've never been to Australia. I know it's there, at least in any sense that I could know. Establishing reasonable beliefs does not set you up for, I have to see everything in order to believe it. What you're doing is establishing a scale, a quality/quantity of supporting evidence to determine whether or not a belief's justified. The more unrealistic a claim is, the more exceptional the evidence to support that claim is. Sagan did the dragon in the garage? And it's kind of, if I tell you I just got a new pet dog, there's nothing in that claim that's exceptional. We know dogs exist. We know people keep them as pets, blah, blah, blah. It may or may not be true, and in this case it isn't because I don't have a dog anymore, but there's nothing that requires a great deal of evidence to support that. And the other thing is that whether or not you believe it doesn't fundamentally change your life. If you find out that I was wrong or lying, the foundations of your life aren't changed. But if I make the claim that I have a dragon in my garage, now all of a sudden we need to have really good proof. Because if a dragon existed and I had one as a pet, that would change everybody's lives. Because it's something new, which seems to contradict known evidence, and it needs the evidence to support it. So the process after setting aside Christianity, considering lots of other things, considering philosophical arguments, all that took several years, and there's not one single argument that was the one which convinced me, or one single moment where I said, aha, I'm an atheist now. It was just one day after all of this, and I'm not even sure which day, I just said, I don't believe that stuff anymore. And the best thing I can say about it is that even after acknowledging I didn't believe it anymore and realizing that I identified myself now as an atheist, that I wasn't done looking at the issue. For some people, it's fine. Once you've made up your mind about it, there's no reason to really consider it anymore or discuss it or debate it. For me, it was, there's no reason not to continue looking. It's an important question. Who wouldn't want to live on after death or experience, a heaven and avoid a hell? But it's not now, the quest isn't so much for confirmation of it. If confirmation ever shows up, I'm all for it. Now what I study is broader based things, because I have not only a strong desire to learn as much as I can about things, but I'm a little distraught by the fact that you could take me and another person who is a fundamentalist Christian, equally intelligent, supposedly equally reasonable, present both of us with all of the evidence that I've reviewed and evidence that I haven't gotten to yet, and one of us would end up rejecting religion and accepting, that they're now an atheist, and the other one would hold fast to their beliefs, in spite of everything. And the only way to describe that is faith. Faith being the belief in something without evidence to support it, or in the face of evidence to the contrary. And I don't feel, Don talked about faith last week. We talked about faith-based beliefs and why they're, unreasonable, unwarranted. So I don't want to necessarily go through all that again, except to say if there's some question that somebody puts before you and you're looking to find the answer, and you have reliable evidence that points in one direction, to go the opposite direction just because it's the most comfortable to you is the exact thing that I'm trying to avoid, or have always tried to avoid since I began this. The purpose is to try to have a good understanding of reality as best we can. It's not any denial. Nothing ever happened that made me mad at God. I just simply stopped believing when it was no longer supported by any evidence or any faith in my head. But I've rattled on long enough, and you'll get to see me every week, so. The content of this video is produced by the Atheist Community of Austin, a nonprofit educational organization promoting positive atheism and the separation of church and state. If you enjoyed this content and are willing and able to provide a donation, please visit the website below.